In 1963, I think, we won our first job in Port Lincoln. My brother Don was the Port Lincoln looker-after, and we stayed there for 20 years. And we did a lot of important building work in Port Lincoln. After 20 years, we were still looked on as those Adelaide outsiders.
Welcome to Building Perspective, the Master Builders SA podcast. I'm your host, Will Frogley. Join me as I speak with some characters in the building and construction industry.
At Dulux Trade, we're making paint easy for tradies all over Australia. With over 230 stores and over 1,000 paint professionals, expert advice for your next job is closer than you might realise. Need specialist advice for a tricky job? Easy. On-site and need it delivered? Easy. So get to know your local Dulux Trade Centre, Inspirations Paint or Paint Spot today. And while you're there, sign up for Dulux Trade Direct for trade pricing and simplified ordering. Because at Dulux Trade, we're making paint easy.
It's great to be here today to start season 3 of the Building Perspective podcast. It's a great pleasure to be here today with an industry legend here in South Australia, and that's Neil Serra. Neil, welcome to Building Perspective.
Thank you, Will.
It's fantastic to have you here today. Now, you've accomplished a lot in your career, and we'll get to all that today, obviously, but have you ever appeared on a podcast before?
No, Will, I haven't.
There you go. So of everything you've done, I'm part of a first here today for you. So like I said, you are a legend of the industry here in South Australia. I'm sure even South Australians who aren't familiar with our industry at all would know the Serra name from driving around town, seeing your sites, seeing your signage. Take us right back to the beginning. How did Serra Constructions actually start?
Well, that goes back a long way, Will. My father was a Melbourne boy. He joined Hansen and Yuncken in Melbourne as an apprentice. He did the available certificates developed in the company to what we'd now call project manager, then called senior foreman. Hansen Yuncken had no presence in Adelaide, but they tended for and won the old Bank of New South Wales, which is now number 1 King William Street with a couple of restaurants in it. So much to the absolute fury of the Fricker family, Hansen and Yuncken arrived in Adelaide.
And we had the Bank of New South Wales setting up shop in Adelaide on North Terrace.
Yes, a 7-storey stone building. So they sent Dad over, and I was only just born when I arrived in Adelaide at the end of 1939. The Hansen and Yuncken wanted Dad back in Melbourne, but the war came and there was a lot of work out at Salisbury. So he stayed here with the family and worked until 1960, when for various reasons he decided to quit Hansen Yuncken. And in that period he'd been the general manager in South Australia. So he decided to start his own little company based out of his study in our family home at Lockley's. And that was in early 1961, and that was the start of it.
And 1961, around that time, I believe that you encountered my grandfather around that time in Lockley's, George Frogley.
Yes, the Sarahs and the Frogleys became very close, both at the golf club and in the Beefsteak and Burgundy Club, and I remember old George, yeah.
Was he a good golfer? Because I know he was a very good football player. I think he was best on ground in the 1933 grand final for West Torrens against Nord.
That's right.
Could he play golf, though?
I don't know, but he certainly spent a lot of time on the golf course. I didn't play with him, but he was a very, very nice bloke.
From the early days, there's another kind of little connection that we've both got in common, and that's living in Port Lincoln. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, in 1963, I think, we won our first job in Port Lincoln. My brother Don was the Port Lincoln looker-after, and we stayed there for 20 years. And we did a lot of important building work in Port Lincoln. After 20 years, we were still looked on as those Adelaide outsiders.
Yeah, I bet. What were some of the buildings you built in Port Lincoln?
The prison, we worked at the high school, we worked at the hospital. We did a lot of work for Safcol. We went out of Port Lincoln into some of the smaller countries towns. Anywhere where there was a job, we tried to grab hold of them.
Fantastic. It's quite amazing. Sarah's obviously a massive business today, huge, and they were our Master Builder of the Year last year. There have been really big projects such as the super schools. How does it feel to have seen the business grow to just such a massive entity that it is today?
Well, naturally, Don and I are very proud of what the boys have done with the business, and Adrian, of course, Adrian Esplin. We're not close to the business. We both keep away in terms of, we resigned from the board some 20 years ago. We transferred the ownership and control of the business. What we know about the business is what they choose to tell us. Which is
nothing to see here.
which is only the good stuff. Will, only the good stuff. Don and I are very proud of what they've done. They've got a fabulous reputation, very, very much focused on being a good member of the building industry. We're very proud.
I've got a couple of good mates who work for Sarah, and it seems that the business has got very good leadership under Adrian Esplin. Tell me a bit about how he managed to find himself in the role of CEO.
We were very much assisted by Bob Borman, who's an ex-Baldstone bloke and a strong supporter of our family. Adrian worked in Adelaide as the state manager for Multiplex. He built that series of 12-storey apartment buildings on the west end of North Terrace. Multiplex wanted him back in Melbourne. He wanted to stay in Adelaide. Bob Borman realised what was going on, and he brought Tim and James and Adrian together, and they struck a deal, and they haven't looked back.
Just going back to some of the earlier days, can you tell us what it was like running a construction business in the 60s and how that evolved through the 70s, 80s and even 90s? What kind of changes did you see in the industry? How different was it to what we see today?
Well, chalk and cheese. Really have been very significant changes. I think there's three key areas that I've watched with great interest. One has been the development of professionalism in the building industry. So if you go back to 1955, there were no degree courses available for builders, comparable with the degree courses available for, say, architects and engineers. Some of the leaders of the industry got together to form what is now the Australian Institute of Building, and their sole objective was to increase professionalism by establishing degree courses in universities around Australia. And so now we graduate something like 1,400 building graduates around Australia every year, and certainly the professional building graduate is on a more equal footing than with the architects and the engineers, and that opens up all sorts of areas of improvements in the industry, and in particular, without that developing professionalism, new concepts such as early contractor involvement wouldn't have evolved as they have. So I think that's been a major development in the industry. The second one that comes to mind, of course, is the very dramatic change in relationships between the master builder and the subcontractors. And again, without going into too much detail, in the 1960s, we were employing our first fix carpenters, second fix carpenters, bricklayers directly, and now, of course, a building company is a group of managers, estimators and project managers, and there is very little or no direct employment of sub-trades. So that's been a major change. I think that had a lot to do with risk shifting. If you employed a larger group of tradespeople, you're more vulnerable to the efforts of the trade unions to improve the lot of their members, particularly with the Builders Labourers Federation in the 70s and the 80s. Risk shifting became a pretty significant force in the industry. That's two of the major changes that I've seen. There's lots and lots of others. Typical building project now has the administration on the site, whereas in our earlier years, the administration of a project was in the office with a site foreman. Now you go to a site and you'll find everybody there, and all you'll find is in head office is the estimators and the bean counters and the HR people. So very dramatic change there.
It seems like Dina English runs a very tight ship on safety down at Sarah today. What was safety culture like, back in the early days in the 60s? It must have evolved a hell of a lot.
Oh, sure. Yeah, huge change. To take a simple example, there were no requirements for hard hats.
No requirements for hard hats.
Steel cap boots.
Wow.
High-vis jackets. These things weren't heard of. No doubt a lot of people wore proper footwear.
So when did hard hats start appearing on your sites? Probably
in the 1980s, perhaps, and that may have been voluntary. Certainly the pressure for safety came from the unions rather than from the employers. So there's been a whole shift in attitudes now. A key corporate objective is not to hurt anybody.
You touched on the BLF earlier, and now everyone's at the moment in Adelaide's talking about the Victorian takeover of the CFMEU, and we're fearing, I guess, more militancy, a more aggressive approach. But compared with BLF back in the day, they're probably teddy bears by comparison, aren't they? Tell us about some of your interactions with the BLF back in the day.
Well, the relationships in Adelaide were reasonably benign if you did the right thing and kept the communication lines open, obeyed the rules. So the real militancy was when Norm Gallagher was alive in Victoria. A classic union tactic in those days was to dump a 7 cubic metre skip of concrete on a piece of formwork 30 stories up in the air and all go home.
Yeah.
Leave a cone of concrete. You couldn't wash it out because that'd get into the sewer, so you had to wait for it to go off and jackhammer it out and start again. So, but our objective, both at a corporate level and at an MBA level, was to avoid the damage to people and property that was happening in Melbourne, to a lesser extent in Sydney, where the Jack Mundy group had a bigger control of the union. Our approach very much, as I say, on both a corporate and a association level, was to keep the communications lines open, talk to both the union people and the government, and I think we managed our industrial relations pretty well. We haven't had in Adelaide serious damage to people or property. We certainly didn't in the many years that I was involved. So.
Yeah, I think it's generally been a pretty collaborative industrial relations environment in South Australia compared with anywhere else. And I know we definitely would like to see that to continue. Yeah. We're in a situation at the moment where we've got a record number of people employed in construction in South Australia, more than 75,000, and we'd just really like to see construction continue to be strong, and industrial harmony is obviously a big part of that, isn't it?
Absolutely, and certainly our company policy is that if we had a problem with the BLF, I'd go and sit down with Ron Owens and we'd try to talk it out. The association took pretty much the same approach. I think the industrial relations officer at the MBA had a pretty much a collaborative approach as well. So, yeah, I think we did pretty well.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that Marcus Parra is the head of the CFMEU in South Australia, the main person on the ground, because whilst Marcus and I might disagree on a lot of things, the lines of communication are always open and we always meet and chat regularly. So I think that is a positive. You've got to keep talking and trying to find that middle ground, don't you?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that was very important. Yep.
So you were a president of Master Builders 73 to 75, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably the youngest MBA president ever, but there was...
And how old were you at the time then?
Well, I was born in 1939, so I was, 34.
That is young, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, there was some politics involved, Will.
Yeah. That would make you the youngest member of our current council, so...
Yeah.
So in the chair at 34 years old. And tell me a bit about, your involvement with Master Builders and how important you found the role of the association to support the membership in the industry in South Australia.
I started having finished and 2 degrees to become the world's most highly trained builder's bean counter. I joined the association when Jim Weeks was president, which would have been I joined the council, would have been about 1987, I suppose, when Frank Kroll's presidency was coming to an end. There was a bit of dispute between Frank and somebody that I won't name about the next president, and the council reached some kind of a compromise and stuck me in there, and that worked out pretty well. I loved the job, but my particular interest was industrial relations. So when I joined the council, I was absolutely horrified to find that the MBA had no industrial relations involvement at all.
Wow. Yeah.
We were represented by all people by the Chamber of Manufacturers. The Chamber of Manufacturers in the 1960s was a group of the metal trades, white goods, motor cars, agricultural machinery, knighted gentlemen of Australia, of South Australia. So a very tight-knit group of manufacturers, all protected by very significant tariffs, of course.
Yeah.
Their interest, of course, was to, and there was a lot of building going on, was to keep the cost of building as low as possible. The union's interest was to eliminate the differential in wages between the Victorian building industry wages, which were set by the building industry agreement, and the lower South Australian wages. So,
isn't it funny that here we are all these years later and we're in pretty much the exact same situation?
Absolutely. So I just couldn't believe that a Master Builders Association had no industrial representation, and if we had an issue, the Chamber of Manufacturers looked after it. So I just undertook as my project to get the MBA directly involved in industrial relations. With the help of the late Jack Evans, we pretty much succeeded in doing that. We started talking to the unions ourselves, and that developed into the sort of industrial relations activity that you've got now in the MBA.
Absolutely, it's the origins with what you did there. So isn't that great? I'm very glad you set that up, by the way, because we definitely need it now in the current environment.
Well, I upset a lot of Adelaide establishment people. I can tell you they were absolutely horrified that we would have the audacity to think that we could represent ourselves.
Is that right? I find that incredible, because surely the Builders Association, IR's core business for so many of the members back then as it is today.
Well, I even upset my old man.
Really? Really?
Yep.
Well, I guess the trailblazers often cop a lot of heat when they're, taking the first steps forward, but then down the track, everyone's very glad they did it, aren't they?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, wow. I find it so hard to imagine people being upset that MBA would be involved in industrial relations.
Well,
it's along with training, you'd probably say it's our two core functions.
Oh, you go back and read the history of the Chamber of Manufacturers in South Australia in the 1960s, where Sir Barton Pope and Sir somebody else were running the show, and they didn't want to be paying more for their buildings, so they didn't want the builders to succumb to the pressure of eliminating this state differential.
Well, it's just as important today because obviously, if building becomes too expensive, a lot of projects just don't stack up and they don't go ahead, and then that has a flow-on effect to employment and everything else through the wider economy. It's really massive, isn't it? I know in Melbourne, it's one of the most expensive places to build in the whole world, and that's why a lot of people have been nervous in South Australia if those kind of payments became anything close to that in South Australia. That we're essentially a big small town here in Adelaide, built on personal relationships, and that's why it's very important we don't reach anywhere near the levels that they've got in Melbourne. Because in Adelaide, I just think a lot of projects wouldn't stack up if we were paying Melbourne type rates.
My view of that is that it's important to be fair and to treat people reasonably. Building workers work in a difficult and sometimes dangerous environment, and they should be paid properly. The key, of course, is if there's going to be improvements in wages and conditions, then some productivity flows out of it, and that's where it gets difficult. It's a difficult area, but keep in mind that on-site wages are but an element of the total cost of a building, and if you can get a building done efficiently and on time, then it may well be worth whatever the costs are.
So you talked about productivity before. Now, productivity in the construction industry has been going down for years and years. Why do you think that is with, evolvements in technology and everything like that? Why is our productivity going backwards, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure how you measure productivity in the building industry. Productivity in terms of economics is output per unit of input. If you're saying that we're getting less output per unit of input of labour despite technological change, then I don't know the answer to that. But there are companies that continue to operate successfully and achieve results. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
If you can figure out the answer to that, please let me know, because it's one that we've been grappling with. It can't just be wages, can it? It's got to be a myriad of factors that are at play there. But I guess if productivity is trending downwards over the past probably 5 or 6 years at least, we've got to turn that around. Otherwise, there's going to be big problems, aren't there?
Well, you'd have to show that it is. I mean, one of the significant shifts in light commercial construction in the last 20 or 30 years has been the tilt slab construction, which has taken a whole bricklayer activity out of the business. You would expect that would be a productivity improvement to start using that technique. But as I say, I don't know how you measure productivity in the building industry.
The ABS produces some statistics around productivity in our industry, and that's the data we've got on. But okay. I think we need to look into that a bit more deeply. One last question that I'd really like to ask you is, how do you see the construction industry today? Do you think it's performing well? Are there some things that you'd like to change if you could? What are your views on the state of the construction industry in South Australia in 2023?
Well, I'm an optimist in all matters. What I see going on is heartening to me. I think the industry is in good shape. Trade associations are doing their job. The union relationships are relatively under control. What disturbs me most is how the great Australian companies, both commercial companies and civil engineering and infrastructure companies, are now increasingly owned overseas. If you look at civil and tier one structural, civil and infrastructure companies, and there's a group called the Australian Contractors Association that represents 20 of them. 19 of them are owned overseas by particularly Spanish, German and French interests, South African interests, Canadian interests, wherever you go. So that the great names that Romantists like me remember the John Hollands, and the Leightons, and the Tees and the Hornibrook and the Balderstone, they've all gone. And I think it's time we, as a group of Australian contractors, just hardened up a bit and started to create what Leighton had until 2010 when it all hit the fan, started to create some of our own Australian-owned significant tier one infrastructure contractors. There's something like $300 billion of infrastructure work to do, and we've hardly got a role in it as Australian-owned contractors. Very upsetting to a old builder bloke like me.
Well, Neil, it's very interesting insights. I really enjoyed hearing them. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast, so thanks for coming on.
Thanks for joining me on Building Perspective. For more information on Master Builders or our guests, please visit our website at mbasa.com.au.